One of the greatest blessings a man can have is a true brother, a true friend. When we want for our brother the same thing we want for ourselves, the well-being of our brother becomes our well-being. His security becomes our security. His happiness becomes our happiness. But also his pain and his sorrow becomes our pain and our sorrow. His problem becomes our problem. As brothers, if we live up to that, and that, sisters, is involved.
This week on Urban Confrontation, Mrs. Betty Shabazz, widow of the late black nationalist leader Malcolm X, discussing Black Citizen in America, Liberation 1970. During the past decade, more than one great black leader has fallen to an assassin's bullet. Along with Dr. Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers, Malcolm X was shot while in the most productive part of his life. Recently, Malcolm's widow, Mrs. Betty Shabazz, spoke at Northeastern University as part of the Distinguished Speaker Series, and she told an audience of black and white students about her life and about her perspective on the black struggle in America. Malcolm X, who before he died was a leader of the black nationalist movement, dedicated his life to the liberation of black men and women in this country and abroad. And Betty Shabazz reminds us of many of Malcolm's contributions.
I was asked to discuss my husband. It states that he was one of the major pillars in the formation of black consciousness, and how do I feel he has made a contribution to black consciousness. Where is the civil right and the human rights movement gone? Has it progressed? The role of women in general, and black women in particular, in the creation of a new American society. Malcolm felt that racism must be uncompromisingly condemned, whether it's overt as in South Africa or whether it's subtle as here in this country. What are Malcolm's contribution to black consciousness? This was sent to me about a month after he was assassinated by the Afro-American community in Paris. And it's opened with a quotation by Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. A life of dedication for human equality and dignity so that the Afro-American people of color everywhere might live as men. His work in the cause of freedom shall not be in vain. Let us ask ourselves, who had the most to gain by Malcolm's death? Was the French authorities' recent refusal to admit him to France an isolated incident? For 400 years, the white man has systematically conditioned the spirit of black man to be subservient and to accept his negative image of himself. Brother Malcolm, in his life, in his leadership and vision, represented in America a breakthrough of the vicious encycling of the white man's diabolical logic. Brother Malcolm was therefore considered dangerous. Brother Malcolm formed a part of a long line of black nationalists. Like them, he stood for the unity and dignity of black people everywhere. He recognized that black people in America would never be free until African people were free, and that the freedom of the African people depend on the freedom of the Afro-American. He showed us that no black man can consider himself free as long as there exists one enslaved black man in the United States, Angola, South Africa, Rhodesia, Cuba, Brazil, and anywhere else in the world. He emphasized that Afro-Americans and Africans were one, not only sharing a common heritage, but also a common destiny. Brother Malcolm's uncompromising demand of his fellow Afro-Americans that they take the Afro-American struggle out of a domestic civil rights issue and put it in its proper context as a human rights struggle, and so internationalize it and thereby seek redress before the nations of the world at the United Nations. This uncompromising demand is one of the most far-reaching and crucial departures from the objective of the established civil rights leaders. These leaders represent the concluding phase of an important era. Malcolm, the beginning of a new era. That is why recent and Newsweek and Harris poll of the Herald Tribune are misleading and false. They have ignored the important age breakdown operating now in the black ranks. For older Negroes, their generation set a goal of integration, intermarriage, integrated parties. For the black youth of the new generation, Brother Malcolm was the symbol of youth and vitality of this era. For us, international politics, the emergence of African nation to independence, the death struggle of colonialism and imperialism, and the heartening of white reaction to the increasing strength of the non-white world. All these factors, all new, have radically changed the character of the struggle. Ballots, Brother Malcolm saw, were important. But even when or if they were obtained, there had to be first a change, a profound revolution in the world's outlook of the black man in America. He must not see himself as integrating into the white society, but he must see himself as a member of a world society of black men with a rediscovery and assertion of his being and of his consciousness.
Since before the Civil War in this country, the struggle of blacks to be free has met hard resistance from the white community. Many of the white men and women seem to feel threatened by the black movement and feel their own freedom and identity jeopardized. Mrs. Shabazz illustrates that all men and women on earth need their freedom to live as human beings.
A lot of white people today feel threatened. Why should they feel threatened? Everyone on earth is fighting for their freedom. Everybody on earth wants their freedom. It's a right, it's innate that they should have freedom. But we find that one anthropological grouping have used their freedom to keep other people from having their freedom. And as long as there is oppression, exploitation, there will be what is going on today. Call it rebellion, call it resistance, call it riots. But this is the nature of a human being. What happened in the struggle in Russia, in France, in Europe, even here in America? What happened in Angola? What happened in Congo? What happened in Nigeria? Black people in America are no different. They say that black people don't have any natural or instinctive desires, that our desires are our master's desires. This is bunk. Black people are human beings with the feelings that other human beings have. But black people must continue to strive for freedom. Man must continue to recreate. No one is going to give us freedom. If anybody was going to give us freedom, we would have had it a long time ago. No one gave anyone else freedom. But what we must have is the potential. We must fight for the potential to freedom, which means that everyone is not going to be a doctor or a lawyer, but certainly in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it states that every human being has a right to an education. Every human being has a right to a suitable job, to a job suitable for the survival of himself and his family. And everyone has the right of proper and suitable housing. Why is it that the worst food, the worst neighborhoods, the worst schools, worst jobs are relegated to black people? This is not fair treatment. Black people are within their rights to resist oppression. And a lot of white people, the power structure, a lot of black people who are conditioned, who are satisfied, look upon black people who resist, who rebel, as troublemakers. But if they were in the same position, they would do the same thing, review history and see what has happened around the globe.
The civil rights movement has changed drastically in the past 10 to 15 years, and some people, in light of today's often violent demonstrations, look at the years of civil rights marches and sit-ins and regret their passing. Betty Shabazz explains that the civil rights marches and the civil rights movement were largely controlled by what she calls white liberals, and in fact sometimes contained the growth of black liberation and not its expansion as many people thought.
What happened in the civil rights march as a concept? These are some of Malcolm's notes. The Negro revolt is controlled by the white man. The Negro Revolution is controlled by the white government. The leaders of the Negro Revolution, the civil rights leaders, are all subsidized, influenced, and controlled by white liberals. No reflection if there are any liberals in the audience. But I think before any solution to any problem can come about, we must first face facts, face reality. And after all, we are not involved in any problems. We're pretending. So that we are going to look at this objectively as if this happened 3,000 years ago. See if we can improve on it. What were the mistakes? And if there were no mistakes, why wasn't anything changed? All of the demonstrations that have taken place in this country to desegregate lunch counters, theaters, public toilets, etc., are just artificial fires that have been ignited and flamed by the white liberals in the desperate hope that they can use this artificial revolution to fight off the real black revolution that has already swept the white supremacy out of Africa, out of Asia, and is sweeping it out of Latin America, and is even now manifesting itself right here among black masses in this country. This was in 1963. Can we prove the Negro Revolution is controlled by white liberals? Certainly. Right after I will leave the state nameless, demonstration, when the entire world had seen on television the police dogs, police clubs, fire hoses, brutality, defenseless brutality against black women, children, and even babies, church bombings. It was reported on page 26 in the May 15th issue of the New York Times. I will leave the man's name nameless. Had a luncheon conference with several newspaper editors from this southern state and had warned these editors that they must give at least some token gain to moderate Negro leadership in order to enhance these leaders in the eyesight of the black masses, or else the black extremist would take over. They said that it was a desperate situation and it must happen. Because at this point, the black masses across the country had begun to take to the streets. There were riots, there were bombings, and the government admitted that it was afraid. Their propaganda was set into focus, and they were encouraging black people to follow responsible leadership. Responsible meaning having those Negro leaders who had some responsibility to the government. So what happened? This grassroots fraction decided that they would march on Washington. It was going to tie up the Congress, the Senate, the White House, and even the airports. They threatened to bring the government to a halt. They tried to stop it, And the more they tried to stop it, it grew. So they decided to join it and control it. And they called the civil rights leaders that was leading it the Big Six. And after they had gotten sufficient publicity, the Big Six, and their image was directly controlled and involved with the march, one of the first duties of the Big Six was to invite 4 liberals to join them. And these 4 liberals dictated the policy. According to the August 4th edition of the New York Times, $800,000 was split between the Big Six. And on June 19th, if everything went according to plan, and if there were no incident, they were to get the additional $700,000. This was for the March on Washington. Their main reason was to control and to direct the mood of the march. I'm not saying that the march was not glorious, that it was not impressive. I'm saying that it was changed from its original intent. And by changing the participants and the content, they were able to change the nature of the march itself. The marchers were told what time to arrive, how they were to arrive, what songs to sing, what banners to hold up, what time to leave, and everyone left was gone by sundown. I remember on the television screen seeing the cleaners, the sweepers out cleaning the streets. Look at all of that money that was spent to contain and not really to get at the root of the problem. Because when it was all over, there were still people without jobs, still children without proper schools, still people starving. Conditions had not changed. Why couldn't they spend this money to help root out the problem that caused the frustration in the beginning? Some are even wondering, is a solution really wanted? The confusion and the conflict that's going on in the world, is it really wanted? Is a solution really wanted? Black people are used as a political football by every party, and yet our problem after 500 years have not changed.
Even though the lot of the vast majority of black citizens in this country is poor, there are still a number of black Americans who have been able to make it in the white system. Betty Shabazz describes how these people are the only blacks who really hate themselves.
Some years back, I believe they said it was about 8 million potential Negro voters in this country, or black voters in this country. And of those 11 million potential voters, only 3 million voted. What happened to the other 8 million? The 3 million is supposed to be the bourgeois, but we find that they are a minority. And they have not communicated the desires and needs of the people, but they have communicated their own. Someone said that they didn't realize that in the ghetto or among poor people there was so much hate and confusion that the people actually hated themselves. I think perhaps there's more love in the ghetto than there is anyplace else in America. Black people love themselves. Some black people. A lot of times people take complaining about our plight, our miserable condition, our lack of jobs, our increased medical problems, our increased disease. They take this as, and when black people complain, they take this as hating themselves. Black people hate the conditions, but few black people hate themselves unless it is part of that 3 million minority.
The struggle for liberation is always changing. Most recently, it is the women's liberation movement that has gathered new momentum in this country and abroad. Mrs. Shabazz concludes her lecture with a description of the role of the woman and her contributions towards society.
These are changing times, and nothing remains static. Women were not to appear to be moving and not moving. Everything else, there is a progression, there is some sort of movement in a progressive sense. And why must women remain in the position that they were in? They say women confuse things. Women started working, and this was to undermine the authority of the father. This was taking jobs away from men. But women have made great contributions. And no one looks at the positiveness of and the endless hours of energy women have spent in doing something constructive. And everyone is still shifting the blame. The blame is not to be on women, the blame is to be on society as a whole. Men have made a lot of mistakes, women have made a lot of mistakes. With the change of the monetary economy, with the moving from rural to urban, from the agricultural to the industrial, or to the big city, where you have a great utilization of space, and where it is no longer necessary nowadays for the family to remain together as an economic unit, there have had to be changes. There was not the large family, the mother, the father, the grandmother, and the grandfather, and the great-grandmother, and all of the uncles and the aunts and the cousins all living together, which formed an economic unit. Now, in some cases, it is necessary for the mother to go out to work. That's why it is necessary to have daycare centers, nurseries, schools. And sometimes it is of benefit to the mother as well as the child, that your child is in a nursery school. So with this, some women now feel they have lost their femininity because they are now out working. Some of them don't feel needed, they don't feel useful. And there have been a sociological change. The man nor the woman have adjusted to this change. Women feel they are not needed. They sometimes feel they are not loved. But obligation and responsibility and affection is needed in a marriage. But because of the economic situation, and it is not necessary to stay together because of money, affection now seems to be the only thing that holds a marriage together or holds a man to a woman. And when the affection wears thin, the man goes one way and the woman goes another way. And there's the ties between responsibility and obligation, which should be, they are not very strong. So it is not left up to the woman, but it is left up to the man and the woman to try to bring about some solution to this problem. And it is unfair for the men to put the blunt of the problem on the shoulders of poor little women. The role of a woman is whatever her qualifications are and whatever the demands are. the condition and the situation and the needs of the people should define the role of a woman. Malcolm said that in a lot of the countries he visited, one of the things that he began to determine rather quickly, it became a game with him. He would go into a country and he said that he could always tell a country whether women were educated or progressive, and he could always tell a country whether women were pushed in the background because the people were as developed as their women, so that women can and will continue to make a contribution to this society. Not just this society in the United States, but to the world society. I'll close with a quote from Malcolm, and he was saying, one of the greatest blessings a man can have is a true brother, a true friend. When we want for our brother the same thing we want for ourselves, the well-being of our brother becomes our well-being. His security becomes our security. His happiness becomes our happiness. But also his pain and his sorrow becomes our pain and our sorrow. His problem becomes our problem. As brothers, if we live up to that, and that, sisters, is involved, perhaps the world wouldn't be in the predicament that it's in. Thank you.
It has been a while since Malcolm X was alive and working for the liberation of blacks. But his widow, Betty Shabazz, continues on her own to bring together the world community of black men and women for their total liberation.